And hello, everyone, and welcome to our All Cardinals podcast number 2 on a very momentous day in the course of an NFL season. Because as we sit here on Sunday afternoon, the day after the Cardinals were supposed to play the New Orleans Saints and did not, the coaches, well, they're all gathered in the rooms at their practice facility in Tempe trying to figure out this roster. That has to be cut to 53 players by Tuesday. And we all know, as we've been working on our own rosters, and that story will be posted on the website later today on this last Sunday in August, I should say, and 2 weeks away from the season opener against the Tennessee Titans. So I'm Howard Balzer. As you can see, Millard Thomas is here, Alex Weiner is here, and we're dabbling with this roster the way the coaches are and saying, boy, we're having a tough time figuring out do they keep 4 running backs or who's the extra corner or what happens here and there. We can imagine what the coaches are going through because their livelihoods depend on it. And they also know they've got to talk to these guys when they give them the word that, well, you didn't make the team. Although I think we can all agree as we start getting into this just in a general introduction, we can all agree that a lot of these bubble decisions, which are probably the last, who knows, maybe 6 to 8 spots on the roster, the guys who don't make the 53, provided they don't get picked up by another team, will probably be on the practice squad. And so that's significant because when you think of it right now, guys, there's 81 players on the Cardinals roster, including the International Pathways Program tight end Bernhard Seikovits, and he will be on the practice squad as a 17th player. So, but 81 guys, 53 on the roster, 17 on the practice squad, that's 70 of 81. So there's only going to be 11 of these guys that likely will not have a job when all the dust clears later in this week. So that's pretty much the way it'll go. And when you look at it that way, certainly you'd rather be on the roster because you make a lot more money than on the practice squad. But at least you're not on the street somewhere wondering who's going to call you next.
Yeah. That's true. And especially with the rules with the practice squad. And we saw this last year with the Cardinals where every week new guys are getting elevated. I mean, a lot of guys on the practice squad ended up playing more than some of the guys who made the 53-man roster. Like Benjamin comes to mind as DJ Foster got cut. I was added to the practice squad. And then for the first, half of the season got, snaps on special teams during games. While someone like, Benjamin, who made the 53-man, did not. So it's not like, we'll never see these guys who get cut again. But Howard, you're right. I mean, if you do get on that practice squad, you have an opportunity to still make an impact on the season for the Cardinals.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest thing to remember. Just because they don't make the active roster doesn't mean it's going to be the last time we see them. So, yeah, like Alex just said, you're still going to be seeing a few of these guys throughout this season. Maybe they get elevated because there's still some situations that's up in the air. Chandler Jones, we still don't know about his situation. Jordan Hicks, there was questions entering training camp. So some of these guys may not make the active roster now, but that doesn't mean they can't have an impact later in the season. And not having that second game or the third game technically in New Orleans does make it tougher for these projections because it was already a shorter preseason than we've seen in the past. And now to make evaluations off only 2 games, it's going to be a lot tougher for this coaching staff.
It really will be. So let's get right into it. We'll probably go through the positions. We'll spend less time on some that are not as many decisions. But if we start right out with the quarterbacks, certainly we all know that Kyler Murray and Colt McCoy will be on this team. And the big question is, do the Cardinals keep a third quarterback? And if they do, it'll be Chris Streveler. But as they try to put all these numbers together, how many players at each position, other positions, and how many guys you have impact different positions. And so that's the big question, whether Streveler makes it as a third quarterback. And if he does, because last year he was the backup, this year he would be the clear number 3. And do the coaches feel that they can create a role for him if he's on the team and active and perhaps be on special teams? So that'll be interesting to see. But that's one of the decisions they're making.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the big key is his willingness to play special teams, his willingness to do other things other than play quarterback. And so, I mean, it's tough because last year they kept 3 on the roster with Brett Hundley and Streveler. This year, I feel like they have a bit more depth at a lot of other positions, especially when you look at the secondary on defense. So I think with those, potential position groups needing maybe an extra guy or 2, it makes it a little bit tougher for the Cardinals to keep a third quarterback. And with Streveler, I mean, if you do, I mean, he's a guy who hasn't really done special teams in games a lot. So, I mean, if you do find a way that, they cut him and then he goes through waivers and you can bring him back on the practice squad, they can continue to work with him there to find a sort of a niche role for him besides playing the quarterback, because he's very obviously the 3. That's why they went out to get Colt McCoy. They saw how he played in week 17. They thought we need somebody a little bit more stable, a little bit more secure behind center. And that's exactly what you get in a backup like Colt McCoy.
Yeah, Colt McCoy is definitely more stable, but if he came into a game, let's say Kyler Murray got hurt, I don't think we're feeling too great as Colt McCoy is our starting quarterback. So with that being said, I don't even have Streveler on my active roster right now, but I do think the Cardinals would like to keep him around if he could stay on the practice squad, just because he does allow you to do a different kind of style with your playbook that you can't do with a Colt McCoy. You could do more of that rushing, scrambling, more of your quarterback, doing some RPO kind of stuff, maybe picking up some yards with his legs. You can't really do that with a Colt McCoy. So I think you at least have an expanded playbook with a Streveler. I think it's a reason why the Cardinals would like to keep him in their system, even if he's not on their active roster.
And I'm still making my decision on that one. I would kind of like to see him on the team and even be active for games, and not only and have a potential package where maybe you don't want to risk Kyler Murray too often, but you would bring Streveler in for some situational aspects of games, which they did last year a couple times early, and then we never saw it again. So it'll be interesting to see what the coach's thinking is. As we move on to the running backs, we're all pretty clear on 3 of the guys, and then the big question is, we think the third one will be Eno Benjamin, but the question is, will Jonathan Ward also make it? Will he head to the practice squad, maybe be elevated, or do the Cardinals keep four running backs? I have a sense that they will keep 4, but again, so much depends on how all the positions balance out on this roster.
I think. Oh, sorry about that.
No, it's all good. I was just gonna say I believe they'll keep 4. Just because when you look at the injury history of a James Conner, it hasn't been too fruitful the last couple of years. This was a guy who, when he took over for Le'Veon Bell, he was a bell cow. He was a stud, but injuries have really zapped him the last couple of years. He's kind of on a prove-it deal this season with the Arizona Cardinals. Then you look at Chase Edmonds. I love the guy, but he's smaller. He's a tinier back. He's not really that built. So when you look at those 2 guys, there is a cause for concern when it comes to injury. So I think they might want to go 4 running backs just to have that extra depth, because you just never know when it comes to that position.
I think that's a great point, especially with Jonathan Ward's build specifically. Like Cliff Kingsbury said, I think it was last week when he was kind of comparing and contrasting, Benjamin to Jonathan Ward, that Ward was sort of the bigger, sturdier, kind of more of a power back. And, if you have those concerns with James Conner, Jonathan Ward is a guy who more closely does what James Conner can do. And I think that I actually think Ward is fairly safe. I'm pretty confident he will make this team. And a lot of that has to do with special teams as well. He had a decent amount of reps last year. I think it was around 39% of the team's special teams snaps he was out there for. So he had a pretty decent role there, especially once they started activating him, which took a couple of weeks to get there. And I think that will make a huge difference for him as far as having a role, not just on the offense, but special teams. So I definitely think he's pretty safe on this roster.
And I think that sturdier point is a good one, because while Benjamin has shown some good play here in the preseason on kickoff returns, probably when it comes down to special teams cover units, you could see Ward being perhaps a little more productive than Benjamin on that. So it's kind of like they have some differing skill sets, but you'd like to have them both on the roster. So we'll see how that one goes as well when we get to Tuesday. Switching to wide receivers, I think there's been a lot of this debate about Andy Isabella. Didn't have the chance because the game wasn't played on Saturday to do some things there. Had a pretty good week of practice. I don't think the Cardinals want to set him free at this point. I do think there'll be some other wide receivers like Antoine Wesley or possibly Greg Torch on the practice squad. Those guys would go through waivers. I think if they put Isabella on waivers trying to get him to the practice squad, someone will claim him. So it looks like most all of us are in agreement that there will be 6 receivers on this team, and that the 5th and 6th will be Isabella and Keyshawn Johnson, along with the obvious 4 of DeAndre Hopkins, A.J. Green, Rondale Moore, and Christian Kirk.
Yep, I think that's a pretty safe assumption. And it's a good point that with Andy Isabella, because he was a second-round pick just a couple of years ago, and, he has a rookie year, doesn't have a big role, then doesn't have really much of an offseason until training camp, going into his second year. And then this year, it's been a little iffy with him being on the COVID list, but you're right. He did step up at practice the last week. I think it's pretty safe to say somebody else would take him if he ends up on waivers. So I think that just, you don't want to lose that asset. Even if you explore potential deals later on, which I'm sure it's getting a little bit late in the game to do so, but you definitely don't want to lose an asset like a second round pick just off of waivers after 2 years in the league. So it seems like he'll have an opportunity again to make this roster on the 53-man.
Yeah, that's how I feel. We know Rondell Moore probably stole the role from Andy Isabella, but that doesn't mean he has to steal his active roster spot as well. Andy Isabella, like you said, second round pick, only in his third season in the NFL. This is a guy who ran a 4.31. So we know about the speed. He is tinier. You got the same, you basically got a clone of Andy Isabella in a Rondell Moore who seems to have a higher upside. So I still think there's a role for Andy Isabella, maybe on the special teams as a returner in this offense. So I still think you could use him out in space, still use him as a gadget guy, maybe still taking a few handoffs. Definitely not going to have the role he used to see the first couple years where the Cardinals really want to make him a thing, but I still believe there's enough opportunity and enough of a role here for Andy Isabella, because realistically, after a DeAndre Hopkins, we expect Christian Kirk to have a role in this offense. We expect Rondell Moore and AJ Green, but none of those, those three guys aren't. They're not like fixtures in an offense. They're not like I don't look at Christian Kirk as an elite number 2 option. So I still think Andy Isabella could still have some opportunities here in Arizona.
That's going to be the big question, is because if you have 6 and who is the 5th, who is the 6th, who's going to be on the active roster, and it still is hard to envision, unless there's injuries, it's hard to envision one of those, the 5th or the 6th guy, getting significant snaps instead of those other 4. But that'll be up to the coaches to figure out if they can, and we'll see how that goes as the games start being played. Tight end, not that many guys to talk about, really. I think we all probably agree that Max Williams and Darrell Daniels will be the top 2 tight ends. Then do they keep a third? I would think they would. Probably comes down to a decision between Ross Travis and Demetrius Harris, who was just signed a couple of weeks ago, hasn't been with the team that long. Of course, Travis was a newcomer this year to the team and had a nice touchdown catch in the game against Kansas City. Harris, more experience in the league with several teams. So this will come down to the gut feeling on the coaches, really, which one of those guys most likely is the third tight end on this roster, assuming they keep 3, which I think it would be unusual if they did not.
I actually had them keeping 2, which I understand is a bit odd, but I just thought that neither really was like, oh, we have to keep this guy necessarily. And I think if you have one or two of those guys on the practice squad, probably just the one. But whoever wins that battle, if he ends up on the practice squad, you can elevate pretty simply anyway. If you want to play those matchups, or if Max Williams is a little dinged up, we saw that a bit last year. Same with Darrell Daniels. So I think they definitely need to keep somebody around. But on the 53-man, I think that one of those 2 guys would be available for them on the practice squad, if not both, once they clear waivers. So I would think Ross Travis has a slight upper hand, just given his skill set as a receiver more closely relates to what we saw maybe at a Dan Arnold. And we got to see that on one drive, which isn't much, but still he had a couple of pretty nice plays against the Kansas City Chiefs in his last game. So I would think that Ross Travis might have a slight upper hand, but it could really go either way. I'm pretty 51-49 on that.
Man, I remember last season when everyone was talking up Dan Arnold as a potential fantasy star for the Arizona Cardinals. The Cardinals should just throw away the tight end position because they haven't been able to figure out and basically their franchise history. So yeah, I had Ross Travis making my third tight end, but you could talk me into him or Demetrius Harris. It's not a position I feel too strongly for. I mean, Max Williams is probably going to be the starter for this team. The tight end position for the Arizona Cardinals, you just stay away from that in fantasy football.
Moving to the offensive line, this is where there's some interesting decisions. How many linemen do you keep? If you only keep 7 or 8, then you're certainly going to have 2 or 3 on the practice squad just for the scout team in practice, because obviously you're not going to have your starters doing scout team work. But 4 starters are pretty well solidified, obviously, with the tackles Kelvin Beachum and DJ Humphries, Rodney Hudson at center, and Justin Pugh at left guard. Right guard is still up in the air, really, and especially because not playing on Saturday. We haven't seen Brian Winters or Justin Murray in a game this year. Josh Jones got a lot of snaps. I think all three of those guys will be on the roster. Who will be the starter is the big question. I believe this team signed Brian Winters with the goal of having him be the starter to bring a physical presence next to Hudson on the offensive line, and it still might end up being that way. But we'll see on that when they get to Tennessee. But there's what is that, about 7 offensive linemen I just mentioned. And so then it's a question, who else makes it? We have Max Garcia, who can play a center and a guard. We've got Sean Harlow, a guard who no one even knew about going into camp, and he played a lot of snaps at guard, but I'm not so sure they want to use a roster spot for him because of the versatility of other guys. And the other player with a question mark is Josh Miles, who's mostly just a tackle. But the thing is with this team right now is, who is the swing tackle? If you go into a game and something happens to Humphreys or something happens to Beachum, who's going to be the tackle that comes off the bench? Now, it could be Josh Jones if he's not playing guard. So that is a little bit of security that you have. And so, but it'll be interesting to see what they do with Josh Miles, if they put him on the roster or just have him try to get him through to the practice squad.
Yeah. I think that's probably the biggest question of this offensive line. I had them taking 8 and leaving Josh Miles just off of it because I like the versatility of some of the other guys. You mentioned Josh Jones could potentially bounce out to the outside. Justin Murray could potentially do the same. He's played tackle before for a full season in Arizona, and they like him inside obviously more than like him outside. But as an emergency tackle, I think that they could use him out there and be fine, or use him at right guard and put Josh Jones out there and also be okay. So I feel like they have enough versatility with those guys that they may not need a 9th or 10th offensive lineman on the roster. And then my 8th guy is Max Garcia, also versatility. You could put him at either guard spot or you could put him at center. And I think just having those guys who could play multiple spots sort of, relieves you from having to bring on extra guys who, may take up roster spots of, a defensive back or a linebacker who you really want on this roster for special teams work or whatever it is that they need. So, but I think Josh Miles would be a good guy to have on the practice squad. Same with Sean Harlow. Same with Michael Minette, the rookie who they just drafted out of Notre Dame. But yeah, I don't think any of those 3 guys end up on the active roster.
Yeah, the Cardinals having 7 offensive linemen we feel pretty good about. That's a revelation for this Cardinals team because, when the Cliff first came to Arizona, I mean, this was a line that was battered, beat up. I mean, I remember everyone making fun of David Johnson for, 2 yards and a pile of dust, but a lot of it was the offensive line, not able to create those running lanes. So the GM has done a really good job these last couple of years rebuilding this offensive line. It's still not elite, but it's got great depth. It's not really – it doesn't have a lot of holes at a lot of positions here. Like you said, Howard, we still need that swing guy because you just see across sports, position versatility is key. So having an offensive lineman that could play tackle, guard, maybe both sides of the line, that's really important in today's NFL. And, of course, when it comes to the offensive line, I think I have 9 on my active roster. But if you want to go 10, if you believe that 10th guy is quality, I think the Cardinals are probably going to elect to lean toward the 10th guy if he is a lineman over maybe another position, just because you got to do everything you can to protect Kyler Murray because he's sounding pretty hesitant to run this season.
The only problem is we move on to our next position. If you have so many offensive linemen on the active roster, then you're limiting at other positions that could be special teams guys. And so that we know that's a priority for this team on that special teams coverage. And so we'll see how that comes about as well. We move over to defense, and the defensive line looks, pretty solid. Remember, the Cardinals play a 3-4. And so when you look at the top guys, it doesn't look like there's too many of those borderline jobs up for grabs. We'll see if I remember them all here. We have J.J. Watt, Zach Allen, Jordan Phillips, Lucky Fotu, Rashard Lawrence. That's 5. And what's 6? One of my, you have Michael Dogby, who might maybe sneak on, but I think he'd be more for the practice squad. I know there's someone that I'm overlooking now. Who's that?
Corey Peters.
Oh, of course, Corey Peters. Yeah, no doubt about it. And of course, he hasn't done a whole lot in training camp, but I think they like him. Obviously, I don't think he's going to start. I think Lecky Fotu or Lawrence will be the nose tackle, but Peters will give you some good snaps, and of course he gives you some good leadership also. So I don't know that there's a lot of debate over which defensive lineman will make the team.
Yeah, I think this one's pretty cut and dry. That's the exact six that I have, and who starts, and do you want to put Jordan Phillips at nose tackle if he's healthy, and those are more so the conversations that I would have about the defensive line. I think who's who. I think that's pretty much solid. I think you're right. Dogby is the guy that you'd like to keep around. He's been here. He's been in Arizona for a minute, but practice squad's probably more so his role.
Yeah, and I think they'll probably I lean to go with Dogby on this. I have 7 defensive linemen just because JJ Watt, as we've been talking about with injury history, JJ Watt, just another one of those guys who he's dealt with injuries, a lot of them in his career. It's felt like he's had like 20 surgeries throughout the course of his career. And Jordan Phillips, he's dealt with injuries. He's been on the COVID list this preseason. So if we're talking about depth, I feel like the Cardinals might want to go with the Dogby on the active roster if they feel like they need a little bit extra depth on that D-line.
Let's move to linebacker. And this team has got some pretty good pass rushers here with some of the depth that they've added and the way that the rookie Victor Dimukeje has played in preseason. And so at that, obviously you have your Chandler Jones, Marcus Golden, Dennis Gardeck, who I think could end up on that injured reserve because I don't think he's going to be ready to play at the beginning of the season. And if he's not, he'll be on the roster. We know that the Cardinals aren't letting him go, but he will probably be either inactive or on physical or on injury reserve at the beginning of the year. You have Devon Canard, who's come back from a kind of roller coaster year last season to play pretty good football. So that's some pretty good pass rush they have there. And even though normally you might only keep 4, I think there's a pretty good chance that they will have 5, at least on the outside, on this team on that opening roster, unless something happens with Gardeck that we don't, if he does end up going on injury reserve.
Yeah, I was just gonna say when it comes to the linebackers, really the big question for me, I mean, we've been talking about Chandler Jones a lot this offseason. Is he still gonna be on this team in 2021? I mean, this guy is a huge, piece to this Cardinals defense. He was probably their best defensive player prior to last season before getting hurt. We know other teams are going to be interested, like the New York Jets, who lost their top pass rusher. I know they just traded for Shaq Lawson. So I'm curious to see about this linebacking cruise to see if the Cardinals want to make a move, maybe go out and acquire another piece, just because you have those questions with Chandler Jones. But I think they're going to do everything in their power to keep him on this team just because he's too good. And this is a team that probably wants to win now, especially if you're Cliff Kingsbury. You hear a lot of people calling for your name. So you want to try to keep the best players you have on your roster.
Yeah, I'd be pretty surprised if Chandler Jones is not suited up for the Cardinals this year. Just they're all in on this year and next year, especially just with how they've, assembled this roster around trying to maximize, the talent level before Kyler Murray's extension, a potential extension, I should say. So yeah, I would imagine he's there. I think like defensive line, the edge rushers, I think is also pretty open and shut. I think who Howard mentioned with, Chandler Jones, Marcus Golden, Devon Canard, Dennis Gardeck, and then obviously the rookie Victor Dimukeje. I think that's your group. And I don't think you could maybe slip in like a Kylie Fitz for special teams work, especially, but I had him just missing my 53-man roster and put on the practice squad. So that's sort of where I'm at with the edge rushers. I think they have decent depth there, and they drafted more of it with Dimukeje.
And I think with Jones, with Chandler, I think that the only way that I could see him move is if someone just bowls over the Cardinals with some crazy offer involving draft picks. And I don't see a team doing that given his age, given the fact he's entering the last year of his contract. And I'm never surprised by anything that happens in the NFL anymore, but I just believe he will be here playing for the Cardinals. Moving to the inside, of course. And then let's remember, too, Isaiah Simmons is going to get some snaps on the outside in all the different packages that Vance Joseph ends up playing. But as we move inside, we have Isaiah Simmons and, of course, Zaven Collins as the starters. Jordan Hicks is going to be in packages when Simmons moves outside. And then you have 2 guys who are essentially on this team for special teams, and that's Zeke Turner and Tanner Vallejo. And I think Miller was a you. I think that didn't have Vallejo on the team, and anything is possible. Certainly, my sense is both those guys will make it because they are so good on special teams, and that's something that, as I mentioned earlier, the Cardinals put a huge priority on.
Yeah, the only reason I didn't have Vallejo just because of just kind of the way my construction of the active roster went. I think I had like an extra player when it came to like O-line, or I think defensive lines where I had an extra player over you guys. So I think that's where Vallejo might have missed the cut for me. But yeah, when it comes to the Cardinals linebacking crew, I mean, this was pretty cut and dry, like we've been saying. Zaven Collins, I'm excited to see him as a rookie. Isaiah Simmons, he's probably one of the most intriguing guys in the NFL this season, to see if he can take a year or two lead, because this is someone that's going to be playing all over the field. He's going to be playing, in the middle. He's going to be pass rushing. You might even see some coverage as well. So I'm really excited for the linebacking crew here. It's very young. It's going to be fast, and they're going to be hungry this season.
Yeah, might get some slot corner, Isaiah Simmons, maybe a little bit of safety. Who knows? It's funny with Millard. You went with one fewer inside linebacker, not having Vallejo. I went with one extra. I took from another position, and I went with Terrence Smith, just because I know the Cardinals. They are big on their special teams units, and their special teams played pretty well last year. That was one of the strengths of the team, aside from kicking. And so I like having both of those guys in there for that. Vallejo also, could have a role, a small role, but a role on this defense. We saw a little bit last year while the team was sort of getting Isaiah Simmons into a rhythm towards the middle and later parts of the season. So yeah, I like having him there for multiple roles. And then Terrence Smith is pretty much solely for special teams. But he was a guy who's been pretty valuable on special teams in his short career, and so I liked having him there, and he played pretty well in his one preseason game as well. So he was a little banged up towards the end of camp. That was the only reason why we didn't really see him on the field much towards the end of it. But I went with one extra inside linebacker on my team.
We moved to the secondary, and at cornerback, certainly with Malcolm Butler, Robert Alford, Byron Murphy Jr., a pretty strong top three. Then after that, it's, wow, what will the combination of those extra corners be? Will it be more veteran-type guys like Darryl Worley and Darqueze Dennard? Although I think rookie Marco Wilson is going to be on this team, so that's a fourth guy. So that fifth spot, maybe six, but probably certainly at least five. Is it a guy like Tay Gowan, who they like his future and his development, and could potentially be picked up if he's put on waivers? And let's remember too, the extra corner might not be active for games. And so if it's going to be inactive, you just soon have a rookie who you're developing than a veteran like Dennard or Worley. And who knows, maybe you keep six. So I think corner is one of the more intriguing situations on this team in terms of this cut to 53 players, in terms of how the back end of that looks.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I'm really interested to see if Tay Gowan makes this team. I had him on my 53. I think that, it's interesting with him. He didn't play last year. He sat out during the COVID season. So, he's only really had one full season of Division I, college football at UCF. But he fits the profile. He's tall, he's lanky, he's athletic on the outside. He's definitely an outside cornerback. He's not going to be used in the slot in Arizona, at least not anytime soon. But I think that because maybe he slipped in the draft a little bit just because he hadn't played that last year, he still has a lot of potential. And he showed some decent flashes in preseason games. There were some moments where he looked like a rookie for sure, but there were also some moments where he showed some real flashes. So I think I would be interested in and hopeful potentially that he makes this roster. But I think that they go with six. I think that they do go with the extra depth. And Darqueze Dennard is that other guy. He's a guy who knows Vance Joseph. He knows that system well. He's played pretty well for the majority of his career. So banged up a little bit at training camp, but I think if you went with another veteran, I think it would be Dennard.
Yeah, and I wouldn't argue with you if you want to go with Dennard. I got them with 5 because there's been a lot of positive buzz around Marco Wilson. Like we were saying, Isaiah Simmons, he's going to be a guy who you can put in coverage. So I think because of a guy like him with that extra versatility, he allows you to not have to carry that extra veteran if you don't want to. If you feel like Darqueze Dennard is better than the other guys who you might be considering on the bubble for the active roster, then go for it. But with a guy like Simmons and the talent he has when it comes to versatility, his ability to guard players in coverage too, like you're saying, possibly the slot, possibly safety. I think because of that, it allows you to not have to carry an extra player in your defensive backfield if you don't want to.
As we move on to safety, some interesting decisions there. Of course, we have Budda Baker and Jalen Thompson look to be the starters, certainly. Chris Banjo is in an interesting situation because of a hamstring injury that has limited him for the last couple of weeks. And so his status, if the Cardinals want him around, then it means probably having an extra safety on the roster because he might not be ready to go when the season starts. Of course, we don't know yet. We still are 2 weeks away from the opener. But you do have Deontay Thompson. You have the rookie, James Wiggins, Charles Washington, who, of course, is also very good on special teams. So once again, as we've been saying, some interesting depth on this team and interesting decisions that the coaches are in the process of having to make.
Yeah, safety is interesting. Especially when you look at, we talked about this a little bit with cornerback, but if you want to go depth, a veteran guy who can add depth like Sean Williams, or if you would rather go with youth like James Wiggins, I think in this case they probably go with Sean Williams here over Wiggins. I think that you mentioned Baker and Jalen Thompson being the two starters; those are the two locks. I think Charles Washington's pretty close to that just because of his special teams value, and I think he's a pretty good pick if you were to wonder who replaces Trent Sherfield as one of those gunners. I think that, Charles Washington will fill in that role. And I think that Sean Williams is that next guy up. Again, another guy, like I mentioned with Canard, who knows this defense, who knows Vance Joseph very well, and who Vance Joseph had enough trust in bringing him back. And then you mentioned with Banjo, I think Banjo makes this team, but you're right, could very well go on injured reserve. And that would give the opportunity for the Cardinals to elevate maybe Deontay Thompson if he passes through waivers, or even James Wiggins himself. So there's definitely a lot of options. I don't know if there's a lot of wrong decisions you can make here. I think it just depends on what they want to do.
Yeah, this was definitely the toughest for me because there's 7 or 8 guys who have a strong case of making it. But I personally just went with Sean Williams and Deontay Thompson over a Charles Washington, not because they're better and they're all pretty much in the same tier, but I felt like Sean Williams kind of gives you what you would want in a Charles Washington. Sean Williams has been a long time starting safety. He's been a pretty good special teams player as well. So I feel like he would be that Charles Washington if you kept him on the active roster. You could still try to put Washington on your practice squad. And then Deontay Thompson, I just kept him just because you can still play that untapped potential card when it comes to Deontay Thompson. He's still 24, 25. He hasn't been in the league that long. So really for him, it was more of an upside kind of flyer choice if the Cardinals want to put him on the active roster.
So we've gotten through the offense and the defense, and we've talked a lot within that about special teams. And now it comes down to the last 3 spots on the roster, which there's probably not a whole lot of debate about. That's pretty clear. The kicker is going to be Matt Prater. The punter is going to be Andy Lee. And the long snapper is Aaron Brewer. There is one other guy on the roster, Ryan Winslow, who was on the roster as a punter. He won't be on the roster. I think we're all pretty sure. But this could be an upset, and teams did this a bunch last year where they would have a kicker or they'd have a punter on the practice squad, mostly in case something would happen to one of their guys with COVID, that they'd have someone prepared. So I'm not going to predict that Winslow will be on the practice squad, but it's a guy the Cardinals know. He's been with them before, and with 16 practice squad spots, he might sneak his way on there, but I think we're all pretty much in agreement of those other 3 players.
Yeah, no debate there. Even if Winslow does not make the practice squad, I think the Cardinals will keep his number pretty close to the phones, just in case anything happens. You're right, with COVID, who knows who could go down in any given week. So yeah, but he's a guy that he's been on the practice squad before, and they brought him back as a guy who was familiar. So yeah, I think that even if he's not there, it may not be the last we hear of him. Hopefully it is, just because that would mean something would happen to Andy Lee, but who knows? He could be a guy who could pop up on the practice squad again at some point.
Yeah, just in terms of your guys' philosophy, who do you want to see on the practice squad? Do you want to lean more toward those younger players who you feel like could have some upside down the line, or do you try to go with guys who were on the bubble of your active roster who you feel like could make a contribution if someone went down with injury?
It's a great question because I think the best answer really is a combination. One guy we didn't even mention was Jace Whitaker, who was on and off the roster last year and on the practice squad a bunch and did get some snaps, and he could end up being on the practice squad. But with the rule now that you can have 6 veterans on your practice squad, it gives you the flexibility to really have both. And so that if you have a guy who suddenly can't play or you want to elevate to the roster, it's nice to have that veteran guy who you can bring up to do that, provided he can also play special teams, depending on who the player he's replacing is. So, but like I said, I think it's kind of have some balance there, because you do have a good number of spots with 16 aside from Psychovitz, and that gives you the ability to have both of those groups of players.
Yeah, I think Howard's totally right that the combination is the best way to go, and you definitely do want to keep that development going. You want to have like Manette, like I mentioned earlier, the rookie. You want to put him on there, or I even put, because it probably won't matter much, because with the practice squad, might be a guy or two who the Cardinals claimed from another team, or there's going to be guys who are on my projected practice squad who get claimed by other teams. So it's probably not the most productive exercise in the world, but it was still a fun one to do. But I still had guys like Bryson Young or Luke Barku, or guys who are pretty young, who the Cardinals brought in for a reason, and who could potentially get more looks, and who they think, okay, he could have some potential if we do give him some more looks. So I think that's also important to go along with guys who, like maybe Michael Dogby, who we mentioned earlier, could come up and step in if need be in a pinch.
Yeah, so I mean, when it comes to the practice squad, I don't really have a philosophy, I guess. I just want to throw that out to you two.
Well, that's all fine. That's all fine. But yeah, I think most teams have that similar philosophy, and most of the time in the past, it's certainly been developmental guys, because that's all you were allowed to have on there. And then with last year, they expanded the group, they expanded the numbers, and allowed veterans to be there. And so if you have that ability, why not have those veterans who can really help? But then you have a situation like last year when the Cardinals had Prince Amukamara on the practice squad. What was it? Maybe the last 6 weeks, something like that, of the regular season. Never got elevated, never moved to the active roster, but he was always there just in case they really needed him. And so I think a lot of teams like having that security blanket a little bit on that practice squad, because there is so much movement on it throughout the year. And let's remember too, a lot of people refer to this cut on Tuesday as the final cut. There's no such thing as a final cut, because it's just the cut to 53, because there's a lot of changes that occur on that. And like you said, Alex, the Cardinals could end up seeing somebody on waivers that I want to bring in. And I've always wondered about that philosophy. That's interesting to me. You have a guy throughout the offseason. He's in your training camp. He knows the players. He knows the system. You're familiar with him. And then all of a sudden you bring in a guy on waivers that you've known because you've scouted, but you really don't know him up close and personal. And all of a sudden you bring him in and cut one of those guys that has been around. I've always wondered about the way teams look at that, but we see all teams do it, and it'll happen. And I think we've seen a few Cardinals players be picked up on waivers even prior to this summer. And a lot of them haven't lasted, but some of their guys have been picked up. So I would suspect that some of the guys the Cardinals waive, feeling they can get them back to the practice squad, will end up being claimed by another team. But, there's so many players put out there. I figured this out. There's 864 players that are going to go off the roster by Tuesday afternoon. 864. Now, they're all not cut, because some guys going into reserve. There's going to be some players around the league suspended and all those things. But still, that's a lot of players. Now, granted, a lot of them start getting signed back to that practice squad. But, boy, that's a lot of movement around the league that happens, and it'll be all happening throughout this coming week. So that pretty much does it for this All Cardinals podcast. You'll be able to see this in a lot of different places. We'll have a story posted on allcardinals.com with stories about what we feel about these cuts. Starting tomorrow on Monday, I have a sense the Cardinals will probably start cutting some players. The worst thing they want to do is have guys out of practice Monday who are going to be cut Tuesday, and then they get hurt, and then they end up having to pay them. So some of it might happen Monday, but the bulk of it will be Tuesday, and we'll be all over it at allcardinals.com. Look forward to the next podcast. So keep coming back to the website and getting all of your Cardinals information.